There are two types of people in this debate. The first type says index funds always win. The data is clear. Stop pretending like you can beat the market. The second type says index funds are for people who don't care enough to do the actual work. And both of them are partially right and mostly annoying. The honest answer is more interesting than either side admits. And today I'm going to give you that answer, including where I personally land, what my own portfolio actually looks like, and the one factor that determines which approach is right for you specifically. So let's go ahead and get into it. And welcome back, everyone. I'm Michael, and this is the Coal Analyst. Before we get into this debate, you need to understand something the finance world calls the two types of investment risk, because the entire stock versus ETF argument is really just a risk argument underneath. Systematic risk is market risk. It's the weather. When the economy goes into a recession, almost everything falls together. When the Fed raises rates aggressively, almost everything reprices. When COVID hit in March 2020, the S&P dropped 34% in 33 days. Great companies, bad companies, it did not matter. The storm hit everything equally. You cannot diverse away from systematic risk. It comes with being an investor. ETFs carry it. Individual stocks carry it. There's no escape from it. Then there's unsystematic risk, company-specific risk. The CEO gets indicated. A product recall destroys a brand. A competitor appears from nowhere. A single earnings miss wipes out 2 years of gains. This risk belongs to one company, one boardroom, one decision you had no visibility into. Here's the thing. ETFs eliminate this second type almost entirely. When you own VOO, 500 companies, one blowing up barely registers. When you own a single stock, that same event can erase 40% of your portfolio before market close. So the real question isn't stock versus ETFs. The real question is, are you actually being compensated for the extra company-specific risk you're taking on? Is there something real coming back to you in return for that additional volatility? Let me show you what the evidence says. And I want to be clear, this isn't cherry-picked. This is SPIVA, the S&P Indices versus Active Scorecard, published annually by S&P Global, the industry standard for measuring active versus passive performance. Over 1 year, 65% of large cap active fund managers underperformed the S&P 500. Over 3 years, 85% underperformed. Over 10 years, 84% underperformed. Over 15 years, 90% of active large cap funds failed to beat the index. Let's pause on that for a second. 90% over 15 years. These are not amateurs. These are professional fund managers with entire teams of analysts, Bloomberg terminals, research, and billions under management. 9 out of 10 of them still lost to a fund that just buys the index and goes home. And it gets worse. Among the funds that were top performers in any given period, virtually none of them stayed in the top quartile 4 years later, which tells you something very important. When active managers do beat the market, the data suggests it looks a lot more like luck than a repeatable skill. The ETF case comes down to this. In highly efficient markets where millions of professionals and competing for the same information at the same time, finding a persistent edge is really, really hard. And the cost of trying, fees, trading costs, like tax drag, means you start every year already behind the index before you make a single decision. But here's where I want to push back on the pure index fund argument, because I think it misses something generally important. The SPIVA data measures professional fund managers, teams running billions under compliance constraints, redemption pressure, quarterly performance reviews, and career risk. That is not you. You're an individual investor with no clients, no redemption gates, no quarterly review, and a time horizon that could stretch for decades, especially if you're in your early 20s like me. And that changes the math meaningfully. So think about it like this way. A fund manager running $5 billion cannot put 10% of their fund into a $2 billion market cap company without moving the price against themselves. You can. A fund manager gets fired if they underperform for 2 years, even if their thesis is correct and playing out. You don't. A fund manager is legally constrained in what they can own and when they can sell. You aren't. Those structural advantages are real, and in certain parts of the market, smaller companies, less followed names, situations where the story is complex and most analysts don't bother covering it, an individual investor doing serious work can find genuine inefficiency. The speed of data actually hints at this. The underperformance numbers are much worse for large cap active funds than small cap. The more eyes on a stock, the harder it is to have an edge. Fewer eyes means more opportunity. Here's where I want to get honest with you, and I'm not flagging this as my opinion based on watching it play out, including myself. The biggest danger of individual stock picking is information asymmetry. It's not even concentration risk. It's your own brain. Specifically, what happens to you psychologically when a stock you own drops 30%. Because here's what the behavioral finance research shows consistency. People do not hold through 30% drawdowns the way they think they will when they're buying. They panic sell at the bottom, or they fall in love with a position and hold it through 60% because the story is so compelling they stop seeing the evidence against it. Or they chase what's moving. Or they sell winners too early just to feel right about something. These aren't character flaws, they're documented, predictable, deeply human responses. It's something called loss aversion, confirmation bias, disposition effect. The behavior finance literature on this is 50 years deep. And here's the irony. Even if your original stock analyst is correct, even if you found a good undervalued company with a real thesis, your own behavior under drawdown pressure is more likely to wipe out the alpha than an analyst being wrong. So the long time horizon is the only real solution I have found. Not because it removes the emotions, but because it extends the window long enough that a temporary 40% drop on a fundamentally good business eventually stops mattering. The people who held Amazon through the dot-com crash reached 92% down at one point, I believe, and held it because their horizon was generally long, ended up fine. The people who sold at a negative 40% trying to outsmart the risk management did not do fine. So time horizon isn't just risk management. It's the most powerful behavior tool an individual investor has. I want to be transparent here because I think it's more useful than abstract advice, and I'll warn you, my split might surprise you given everything I just said about the data. I'm mostly in individual stocks, not a small sleeve. Most of my taxable portfolio is in companies I've done real analytical work on. Before you think I'm contradicting myself, let me explain exactly why and why it might be right for me, but not necessarily for you. I'm almost 21, so my time horizon is generally 40 years. I studied this full-time, finance degree, CFA, and I do work in the industry. So analyzing companies isn't a weekend hobby. It's most of my week, and I have no external pressure whatsoever, no clients, no quarterly reviews, no career risk if a position is down for 2 years while the thesis plays out. Those conditions are rare for most people, I understand, and it changes the math. So the speed of data measures people who can't hold through a 2-year drawdown because their investors will redeem. I can. That difference is the entire ballgame. But I still do own some ETF exposure because even with all of that, I know my behavioral risk is real, and having a position that requires 0 decisions on bad days is very valuable. It's part of my portfolio I never have to think about. My split isn't the right split for most people, it's a split that matches my actual circumstances. Here's how to actually figure out which approach fits you. Time horizon under 5 years, ETFs, full stop. Individual stock, they need time to play out, so short-term volatility is too random. If you don't want to read a 10K or do deeper research, obviously ETFs. The work required is you have to have work to have an analytical edge. If you're not doing it, individual stocks aren't investing. They're just unsystematic risk you're not being paid for. Honest behavior weakness. If you have that, ETFs. Knowing yourself is worth more than knowing any individual company. If you've ever panic sold before, if you fall in love with positions, if you chase momentum, index funds remove these decisions entirely. That's not settling, that's just self-awareness. Long time horizon, genuine industry knowledge, discipline to hold through real drawdowns, willingness to do actual analytical work. Individual stocks are legitimate, and the structural advantages are real. And the odds are not 0. They're just harder than what most people think. The honest answer is that ETFs win on the data, definitely over long periods against professionals with every advantage you don't have. That number shouldn't humble every stock picker, including me, but the data is measuring the wrong version of active investors for most individual investors. A 21-year-old with a 40-year time horizon, no redemption pressure, and real analytical work is a completely different animal than a mutual fund running under institutional constraints. ETFs as a foundation, always. Individual stocks only with real work, genuine conviction, appropriate sizing, and a long enough time horizon that short-term volatility stops being a reason to make decisions. That's not a compromise. That's just honest about what the data says and what the real advantages of being an individual investor actually are. New video every week. Like and subscribe if you got something out of this one, and see you next time.